This video is going to attempt to summarize the history of the lineage of hominin, which led to Homo sapiens in the last million years or so. Homo erectus first appears on Earth almost 2 million years ago and spreads throughout Africa, spreads throughout Asia, even into Indonesia, and then into Europe potentially. But then here we get to an interesting question. When you find skeletal remains and you want to identify them as a species, the definition of a species is populations which can interbreed together under natural conditions. So could the fossils from Western Europe, like Spain, starting from 1.2 million years ago to 900,000 years ago, could they interbreed with Homo erectus? Were they a separate species from Homo erectus? Well, we'll never be able to test them obviously to see, could this individual reproduce with this individual? Are they both Homo erectus? Is this Homo antecessor and this Homo ergaster? How many species should we classify? Well, this is an interpretation and experts vary. Some tend to be lumpers and make one big variable species. Others tend to be splitters and split groups into different species. And so therefore, when it comes to these names, we could certainly disagree, and certainly experts do. But as we get in the last million years, there was a population of Homo living in Western Europe that was using caves continually as kind of base camps, dragging carcasses there. They were preserving the skeletons of the dead in the back of the cave. So, the quote pit of bones belongs to this group. However, they do seem to disappear, and then later another population, which is called Homo Heidelbergensis, appears. Now, Homo Heidelbergensis is named after a German find near Heidelberg, and the mandible was particularly noteworthy. So notice this time frame, 780,000 years ago to 130,000 years ago. So that's quite longer than our species, which is maybe a little more than 200,000 years. So a very long time period. It was recognized that this mandible from the specimen was different enough from that of a modern human that it had to be a different species. And so this is the original find. Now, the question then comes, what other skeletons belong in this group? So the original finds, it seems that the crania are within human range as far as volume, although at the lower range of this volume, the face is a little lighter and thinner compared to the earliest members of Homo, so perhaps intermediate between the earliest members of the genus Homo and modern members. But then we can ask questions, because if we're going to start putting fossils into different packages, you belong to this species, you belong to this species, if there's disagreement as to what constitutes a species, then the family tree of humans could obviously vary from one expert to another. So for example, in one model, Homo antecessor in Europe leads to Homo heidelbergensis in Europe. And then Homo heidelbergensis could then lead to Neanderthals in Europe, possibly Denisovans as well. I'll explain those in a second. While a different population of Homo erectus leads to fossils like this, Homo rhodesiensis, which leads to Homo sapiens. So in this first model, the original interpretation, Homo heidelbergensis is non-ancestral to modern Homo sapiens, but rather other groups, including Neanderthals, which survived until more recently, but it is a side branch of this this family tree. However, as different individuals analyze fossils in different ways, some now say, oh, well, this fossil from Africa, I think that this should also be classified as Homo heidelbergensis instead of its own species like Homo rhodesiensis. Just as one could look at, one dog skull and another dog skull, they're a member of the same subspecies, even not only the same species. These skulls differ by a lesser degree than, say, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua or a pug. So, based on skull variation, one variable species could perhaps accommodate this much variation. So if this then is one species, then Homo heidelbergensis is known from Africa, from Europe, and some potential Asian finds as well. And from Homo heidelbergensis would come Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. And so there are all of these finds, some partial, some relatively complete. They occur at different time points over hundreds of thousands of years in different continents. And so then the theoretical question, how do we lump them together into reproductive species? And that then affects the family tree, which is drawn afterwards. So once again, not wanting to get too hung up on what's a species. But when we look at the planet, say 200 to 100,000 years ago, the reality is there would have been a bunch of species of human alive. Now, there are lots of species of cat alive today. They're related cats, but they're different species. There are lots of species of bear or of dog or of sparrow. So this is certainly normal. There were lots of species of the genus Homo. So there would have been diverse species in Africa. Once again, that skeleton that we just saw, is it its own species, Homo rhodesiensis? Is it part of Homo heidelbergensis? We could argue. There would be Neanderthals in Europe, Homo heidelbergensis throughout Central Asia. Homo erectus was known in Southeast Asia, even into Indonesia, places like Java. The dwarf species Homo floresiensis was known on the island of Flores, the Denisovans known from Central Asia. And so there were multiple species known throughout the world during this time period. So thus, if there was only one lineage, then constructing a family tree would be easy enough. But there would then potential multiple lineages, with some not being entirely related. Now, there is a group known as the Denisovans, which are not well known. There is a cave in Central Asia which has remains of Homo sapiens, has remains of Neanderthals, so two different species lived here. But then there were also some isolated remains, which included finger bones from a young girl. And these finger bones preserve DNA. And when the DNA was studied, it was as different from Homo sapiens as Neanderthal DNA is from Homo sapiens. Given that Neanderthals are considered to be a different species based on this DNA difference, then here is another species of Homo that we don't have full skeletons of, but we do have their DNA enough to realize that it was a different a species. And so Central Asia seems to have had a species known as Denisovans. And as I will mention in a second, some Denisovan DNA, now that we know what it looks like, is present in some Asian populations, in some more than others. So in areas of Southeast Asia, such as here near Australia, the amount of Denisovan DNA is much higher than the 1% to 2% that one might observe, say, in China, but it could be like 4 or even 8%. So some modern humans do have some Denisovan in their ancestry. And as we study the Denisovan genes, one example is known where the genes in a certain sequence, known as a haplotype, may actually be helping modern Tibetans adapt to high altitude. So the modern Homo sapiens living at high altitude in Tibet may be benefiting from genetic sequences from Denisovan humans, which adapted to live at high altitude. And so that was one species of human alive in addition to Homo sapiens. As the ice ages separated and the ice sheets separated Europe, then a population evolved from Homo heidelbergensis known as Neanderthals. Now, they were certainly members of the genus Homo. Their brain volume is certainly within modern human range. In fact, it might actually be a little bit bigger. So some Neanderthal cranial volumes are actually larger than many modern humans. We have some of their DNA. We know that some of them may have had red hair. And certainly they were different. Now, all throughout the skeleton is broader. Muscle attachments are much more significant, so they would have been very strong. They seem to be thicker, all right, as which isn't that unexpected, given that they were living in a Europe which was dominated by ice ages. So when I look at my form tends to be long and thin. And we often see this in populations which are trying to lose heat. All right, so my form seems to suggest that my ancestors came from hot places in the not too distant future. Or not too distant past. Other populations which are adapting to cold, they'll tend to be thicker and lose heat less easily. While the skull had a great cranial volume, the skull had a very different shape than that of humans. So, if you look at my forehead, I have a small brow ridge and a forehead. So note that that's noticeably absent here. There's a very prominent brow ridge, and this skull, instead of being short but highly domed, is low. There's no forehead, but long, and this occipital region forms this occipital bun here. Now, it's one thing to look at cranial volume and the size of the brain is important, but also what does that do to different brain regions? Because different parts of the brain do different things. So, this prefrontal cortex is where a lot of our our higher processing occurs. This skull seems to have a different shape. All right, how did that affect the parts of the brain that we use for social complexities and much of our personality and the distinction between past, present, and future. So obviously we don't know answers to that question. And so in the not too distant past, there were multiple human species. Neanderthals are known from the Middle East, and Neanderthals are known from Europe, and so the distribution of the ice sheets certainly seem to have helped to determine their geographic distribution. And so there, in this world where there were multiple human species, a new group evolved in Africa. So Africa is not only the birth of our hominin lineage, in that 5 to 7 million years ago, Aurora and Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus were only from Africa. But then in, say, the 4 to 2 million years ago range, the Australopithecines are known only from Africa. So Africa is certainly very important in the human lineage. But then our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is known from Africa as of, say, 200,000 years ago. There's a recent find that might push that back a little further, but so I'd like to just be a little conservative and go with the 200,000 years as opposed to 300,000. But Homo sapiens is known in Africa since 200,000 years ago. It is known outside Africa in the last 100,000 years. And so our species, Homo sapiens, spent at least half of its history in Africa only. So Africa is the birthplace of multiple, sets of, our family tree, including the species. Given that Africa is where our species spent the first half of its history or more, it's not then surprising that when you look at the branching of the genetic human family tree, so if you start comparing sequences around the world, that most of the deepest branches are found only in Africa. When human genome started being discovered, one description I thought was a beautiful synopsis of it. So if you don't mind, one synopsis was you could compare the sequences of two individuals who live in Nigeria, and they could only be living, say, 100 miles away from each other, but they could be more genetically different from each other than someone living in England and someone living in China. That was, the comparison. That doesn't seem to make any sense. But once again, if you think that down here, the first members of Homo sapiens lived in Africa, then they would have diversified and spread out, various lineages. But if for 100,000 years, all of these lineages lived only in Africa, that means that some modern Africans might, say, be from branch 4, all right, whose last common ancestor with Africans whose branch number 1 was a very long time ago. In contrast, if it was here that there was the common ancestor of some individuals who stayed in Africa and some who traveled into Asia, then these Africans are more genetically similar to these non-Africans, say Europeans and Asians, than this African is from this African. They haven't shared a common ancestor in quite a long time. And so as we study the genetics of modern populations, or even other attributes like languages, so there are some African languages which involve clicking sounds, which are thought to be a very early language when we consider the branching of languages. That's fascinating. So Homo sapiens arises in Africa, and for half of its history is known only in Africa. There seems to have been some migration into the Middle East, and it's possible that that was not successful because there are caves where there's Homo sapiens known, and then no Homo sapiens but Neanderthals, and then later Homo sapiens again. And so there might have been an early attempt to colonize the Middle East, which was not entirely successful. Around 70,000 years ago, there seems to be a group which migrated from Africa and spread throughout Asia, which apparently hugged the coast, so that their fossil remains are known close to the ocean at the time. So they would have then, gotten to China and then to Indonesia and even Australia, starting 70,000 years ago or so. Now, one complicating factor is that there was a volcanic eruption known as Toba about 73,000 years ago. Now, certainly it was significant. Some estimates pointed to be extremely significant. So some have said the reason that even though India and China are located so close to each other, but that there is a significant genetic difference between modern inhabitants of India and China, was that this volcanic eruption would have devastated the populations living in this area. So once again, if this was a significant volcanic eruption, that might explain some aspects of modern human diversity. And so as Homo sapiens spread. From 70,000 years ago, a group would have traveled throughout South Asia and then even reached Australia and been the ancestors of the original Australian populations. And then maybe 40,000 years ago, then a population from Central Asia was then able to make it into Europe. And so Africa was the only continent inhabited by Homo sapiens. But then, once again, maybe 70, maybe 100,000 years ago, Homo sapien, some populations migrated through Asia and then even reached Australia, and then more recently into Europe. And then, so then the big question then is, well, what happens? Because there were already people living there. All right, so there were multiple species throughout the world. Indonesia wasn't uninhabited, Asia wasn't uninhabited, Europe wasn't uninhabited. So when Homo sapiens gets to these new continents, what happens? I would like to ask that question 3 different times, once for Africa, once for India, once for Europe, and then go through 2 big possibilities. So there are 2 models. One is replacement, one is regional continuity. So what happens as Homo sapiens spread throughout Africa? Well, obviously, if we were to list all of the potential species which have been identified as living in Africa, it's a long list. Now, we could argue, was Homo ergaster a population of Homo erectus? Were they different species? Once again, there's potential different species in Africa when Homo sapiens appears. What happens? Well, in what's called the replacement model, all of these other groups die out and only Homo sapiens survives. So if you ask modern Africans, where have they originated, then in the replacement model, then all modern Africans would stem only from Homo sapiens, which replaced the others. In contrast, a second model is what's called regional continuity. It is possible that as human groups diversified, that some members of this group met members of some members of that group, that they intermarried, they interbred. And if that were the case, then modern Africans would not be descended from one group only, right? But rather than would have at least some genetic contributions from multiple groups if they interbred. And so those are 2 different models for modern Africans. We could ask the same question of modern Asians. Where do modern Asians have their ancestry? Well, when Homo sapiens gets to Asia, 70,000 years ago or so, there were certainly other species which were living there and other species which were older, members there. So what happened? If the replacement model is true, then only Homo sapiens survives. These other groups, they have no representation in the ancestry of modern Asians, which would come from one group and from one group only. If, however, the model of regional continuity is more valid, then Homo sapiens might have intermarried, interbred with some of these other populations so that modern Asians would have multiple human groups as ancestors, not just Homo sapiens, but some of these other groups as well. We could ask the same question for Europeans, where we could ask, where is their ancestry? Because Europe was already inhabited by Neanderthals and Homo Heidelbergensis not too long prior when Homo sapiens got there. If the replacement model is true, Homo sapiens replaces the other groups and they're completely wiped out, or they die of disease, or there was that volcanic eruption or whatever. If regional continuity holds, then there could have been some interbreeding, say, between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, which provided the gene pool of modern Europeans. So then the question is, where do we, come from? Whether our ancestors were from Africa, from Asia, from Europe. Well, skeletally, we certainly seem to look like Homo sapiens. All right, we don't have much of a brow ridge. We have this forehead. Our limbs are long and thin, unlike some of the more robust forms which had adapted to colder climates. So from skeletal evidence, one would say it seems that Homo sapiens largely replaced the other groups. We could argue about, this child found in Spain, this fossil, or some of the what is called Homo erectus from Asia. Do they have some similarities to modern Asians? So we could argue anatomically, but the largest point is, it seems that primarily we are all descended from Homo sapiens and not that those other species. That would be the primary conclusion. However, so we're, this is kind of introducing the next model, is once again, if Homo sapiens met some of these other species, what would have happened? Would they have interbred? And so I have there's a bunch of videos in this playlist which are, a little on the sillier side. This one, you have a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens reciting a modification of Shakespeare, so O Romeo Pithecus, O Romeo Pithecus. Recently, in addition to being able to study anatomy, we can also now study genes and gene sequences. So this is a powerful new tool that we can use. And so if we were to then say, all right, well, we know what Homo sapiens DNA looks like. We have fossils of Neanderthals where we can recover their DNA. And then we even have Denisovans, and we know what their DNA looks like. So we could ask individuals living in different continents, do you have any representation of other species? So if we were to ask a modern African, we would typically find no Neanderthal DNA, no Denisovan DNA. And so as far as we could then say that this African would only have that one species, Homo sapiens, as their ancestor. Now, we might change this if fossils from Africa could produce more DNA. So once again, we only have 3 samples of DNA we can test: Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, Denisovan. If we had Homo rhodesiensis, if we had a 4th, then we might find Homo rhodesiensis in multiple groups here. But based on the only 3 that we have for comparison, this African is descended only from Homo sapiens. If we were to ask this modern European, we would interestingly find that maybe 1 to maybe even 2% of their DNA could stem not from Homo sapiens, but from Neanderthals. So genetically speaking, they would have the vast majority of their genetic inheritance coming from Homo sapiens. But there is evidence of at least a little interbreeding, so that some of their DNA has come from Neanderthals as opposed to the Homo sapiens, which entered Europe maybe 40,000 years ago. If we were to go to Asia, we could maybe sample multiple populations. Asia obviously is a huge continent with multiple genetic lineages. And so this Asian might find that 1, maybe 2, but probably 1% of their DNA could also have come from Neanderthals. But now there are actually Denisovan sequences which can appear in Asian populations. So here are 3 distinct human groups who have contributed genes to modern Asians. So obviously, the majority of it is red. So the majority of it is from Homo sapiens, which entered Asia recently. But there apparently was some interbreeding with other populations. If you were to go into other populations in Asia, perhaps New Guinea, one could find, maybe some Neanderthal DNA, maybe 1%, maybe a little more, but then maybe as much as 5, or even I read one study as much as 8% of the genome could be Denisovan. So once again, mostly Homo sapiens. You see all of the red here, but evidence of some different some interbreeding between populations. All right, and so I have a few more videos. Some of them are a bit sillier. One before I get to those, I'm sorry, I forgot this one. Then we could then ask how these populations spread throughout the world, how they followed groups of mammoths, how they were affected by the receding ice sheets in the past 10,000 years. Relatively recently, they reached the Americas from Asia. It was originally thought that that occurred maybe 10,000 years ago, but then in sites ranging from the western United States, the eastern United States, and then as far south as Chile, that it was evident that this occurred earlier, because you can find finds 15,000 years ago, which are older. And so, for example, 12,000 years ago in Orange County, New York, at a place named Lookout Mountain, there was evidence of human habitation, including some tools. One, which was interesting, was an atlatl point. So before there were bows and arrows, one could have a spear thrower that one could hold like this, and to throw and propel this further and with more strength, perhaps trying to pierce the hides of relatively large targets like mastodons and mammoths. And interestingly, this was made of jasper. It was kind of yellowish, and it seems to have come from the Philadelphia area. And so not only were there evidence of human tools, but also of human migrations, perhaps following migrating animals as ice sheets retreated, and seasonally traveling along rivers, etc. And so we could then trace humans spreading throughout the globe to modern areas, including the Americas, North America, South America. That would certainly be an interesting tale. In Orange County, New York, where I teach, actually one of the older sites in North America from Lookout Mountain. So that's significant. I have other videos. One which just considers how much skull change would you need to take some of these other species into Homo sapiens. Well, if you consider, and previous videos have gone into this, the amount of difference you see in the skulls of, say, old world monkeys or new world monkeys, or lemurs or cats or dogs or bears, this really isn't that much change. I mean, it's significant, all right, the increase in cranial volume, the flattening of the face, reduction of the brow ridge, but it's not that significant when one compares our species to the skull variations we see in other groups. Certainly it is significant that the volume of our cerebrum and cerebellum is 3 times larger than that of chimpanzees, but all the brain regions are the same. And we can see, differences in brain volume much greater than that among different groups like sharks, or, if you look at bats or old world monkeys, some have a smooth, I'm sorry, if you look at some primitive groups, such as primitive primates, the New World monkeys, or if you look among rodents, some can have a smoother cerebrum, some are more highly folded. So brain differences clearly, exist in groups, and so this is not that out of the ordinary for groups which have been separated for millions of years, and so. Modern humans have not existed throughout all of Earth's history, certainly, and nor the majority of Earth's history. Instead, there seems to be this great family tree where, from chimp-like ancestors 5 to 7 million years ago, there was a lineage which only has one modern surviving group, ourselves, Homo sapiens. But along the way, there were many species of hominin which existed, and we can see very gradual changes, not only in the size of the brain, but also adaptations for upright walking, etc.